Welcome, everybody. Good morning or good evening to those of us who are those of you who are joining us from Bangladesh. A very warm welcome to the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. My name is Rochona Majumdar, and I teach in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations in Cinema and Media Studies, and I'm a fellow of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. One of the things I wanted to say at the outset is that 3CT, the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, is marking its 20th anniversary this year. And among the many themes that we think about, are concerned about, are democracy, film and media from the global south, popular politics, the corporate university, and many others. So please check out our events at cct.uchicago.edu. But publicity is not really the only reason I mention these things. The panel that you see in front of you, who I'm going to introduce very briefly in a little bit, actually brings together many of the abiding concerns that 3CT has. So I'm not going to take up a whole lot of time and just offer my thanks to Anna Searle Jones and Ryan Eichholt and Kerry Sharkey for their help in the logistical organization of this event. And a huge thanks actually to Nusrat Chowdhury, who helped imagine this event. She brought all of us together. And for that, Nusrat, you're no stranger to the University of Chicago, and we hope you'll never become a stranger to the University of Chicago. I must say that one of the impulses to organize this event was several of my undergraduate college students asking me that why aren't we talking about Bangladesh when all of the country was in fact gearing up for the US elections. There was a lot of talk of India, but why not Bangladesh? And I happened to meet Nusrat at a conference, and I mentioned the urgency that I heard in many college students' voices, and we decided that it would be a good idea to change that. So on our panel today, we have, in the order in which they will present, Nusrat Chowdhury, Naeem Mohaiemen, and Navine Murshid. I won't say a whole lot about them. Nusrat is an associate professor of anthropology at Amherst College, currently on research leave as a fellow at Notre Dame. Naeem is associate professor of in film at Columbia University, and Navine Murshid is associate professor of political science at Colgate, but currently actually is joining us from Bangladesh. All of them are prolific writers, and in Naeem's case, a prolific maker as well. And I'm sure they'll talk more about their work. And I'll keep quiet. Each of our panelists will go in the order that I mentioned, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you for this invitation, and thank you, Rochona. I don't want to be a stranger to Chicago ever, although hearing that it's 3CT's 20th anniversary makes me feel quite old. But thank you, as always, for organizing a conversation on Bangladesh, and I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with all of you, especially my fellow panelists who are dear friends and whose work I draw from, and I think with. So it's really an honor. So I'm just going to start, and I'll try to restrict my comments to more or less 10 minutes so that we have more time to discuss the issues later. So on a wall near the official residence of the chief advisor to Bangladesh's interim government, and this photo was taken in October, a simple sign in English stood out in a sea of colorful graffiti. It listed the names of the three largest political parties of the country, Bangladesh Awami League, Bangladesh Nationalist Party or BNP, and Jamaat or Jamaat-e-Islami. Bright red crosses by the first three signal strong disapproval of conventional politics, while the last option, new, boasts a tick sign in green, a clear mandate for what is being imagined as Bangladesh 2.0 by the largely young protesters who have led an unprecedented political movement against the longest reigning ruler in modern South Asia, Sheikh Hasina. This particular message, too, was sharing wall space with the now famous lines, Pani lagbe pani, would anyone like water, spoken by the student and activist Mir Mahfuzur Rahman Mugdho, who was killed by the police at the peak of the protests on July 18th, 2024. One of the last images of Mugdho circulated posthumously as video reel. It featured him handing out bottles of water to weary, unarmed protesters victimized by tear gas shells, rubber bullets, and gunfire deployed by the police, the paramilitary, and Awami League party goons. Mugdho is one of around 1,000 people killed in Bangladesh in July-August 2024 until the former Prime Minister's ouster on August 5th, 2024. So together, the sign that dismisses the old order and Mugdho's voice that reverberates as a powerful slogan capture the zeitgeist of this extraordinary set of events. At one level, this juxtaposition memorializes the violent excesses of the state and the sacrifice of ordinary citizens. At another, it signals long simmering dissatisfaction with politics as usual, exemplified most blatantly by the Awami League and its authoritarian grip on power for almost 16 years, though the disenchantment conveyed in the sign is certainly not limited to it. The uprising began as a movement to what Lisa Mitchell calls hail the state and morphed into one that vowed to radically reimagine it. And I'm drawing here from Lisa Mitchell's new book called Hail the State, where she talks about how disgruntled citizens in modern South Asia more often than not articulate their grievances by recognizing or hailing the state, and in so doing, remind it to be more just or inclusive. It is when the state fails to reciprocate, that is, declines to recognize the demands or those who are making them, the aggrieved collectivities become antagonistic and violent. So how did a demand for quota reform, something the New York Times has called a bread and butter issue, rise to the occasion? Recognition or its refusal, in addition to heavy-handedness, has catalyzed this shift. For this, the larger context is, of course, crucial, one marked by long-standing corruption, crony capitalism, and the violent repression of rights, particularly the right to free speech, during the 16 years of consecutive rule of the Awami League. This, in addition to the elections of dubious integrity, including the most recent one in January 2024, without the participation of the main political party, have all exacerbated the situation. So the demand for quota reform then, as Professor Ali Riaz has described it, is a spark that started the fire. At the center of all this has been the figure of the student as an agent of politics, and that's what I kind of wanted to highlight in my short comments today. Recognized as such, the student or chhatro carries a political potentiality in Bangladesh that I think is a little different from other parts of South Asia. The region, as we know well, has witnessed vibrant student activism during the anti-colonial struggles of the early to mid-20th century and later during Maoist insurgencies in Bengal in the 60s and 70s. Still, the student, as a formidable figure in national politics, has not always thrived amid mainstream political machinations. Bangladesh may have been an exception to this. Here, chhatro, or student, has remained a powerful repository of political hope. The 1969 People's Movement against Ayub Khan's military dictatorship had famously unified student activists from both wings of Pakistan. Since the 1990 democracy movement against the dictatorship of Ershad and the 2007 campus protests against a military-backed caretaker government began as student-led movements that toppled regimes. The first quota reform movement of 2018 and the demand for road safety the same year, both direct precursors to the July Uprising, were also steered by students, some of them teenagers, whose primary identity was that of a student. Through sheer grit and impressive organizing, the student coalition that led the July 2024 uprising once more highlighted the political heft of the student as a sovereign political agent. This was acknowledged by their recruitment as advisors to the interim government, a first in Bangladeshi politics. But Chhatru or student has also been mobilized cynically, not the least in the summer of 2024. The students' identity was often questioned by the authorities even before they took part in violent street protests or fought back law enforcement. The most powerful example of this is, of course, Sheikh Hasina's use of the term Rajakar to dismiss the students, and my fellow panelist Navine Murshid has already written about this. At a press briefing on the afternoon of July 14th, roughly 2 weeks into the sit-ins, the former prime minister mocked the protesters as Rajakar, or rather, the descendants of Rajakar. The Urdu term for volunteer is now a part of Bengali vernacular and has particularly incendiary connotations. It was once a label for Bengali civilians who had sided with and were trained by the Pakistani army during the 71 War of Independence. But Rajakar had made a resurgence as a political weapon of othering and silencing during the Awami League era. A flippant comment became an assault on the dignity of the students who were called traitors en masse. It also brought into relief a divisive approach that the Awami League had perfected as a political strategy. This entailed a complete ownership of the origin story of the nation, in which the Awami League had led the country to independence and established a secular democracy after years of military rule. In this, what my other fellow panelist, Naeem Mohaiemen, calls an obedient and hagiographic history, anybody critical of the government is labeled Islamic radical or terrorist, in short, Rajakar. So one of the slogans of the July uprising, Pa chatle shongi, na chatle jongi, in short, if you lick in Bangla, if you lick boots, you're a friend, if not a terrorist, makes clear that the ruling elite strategy of harnessing political fault lines through discursive othering was finally coming undone. The student protesters pushed back on the tag, but more important, they reclaimed and resignified it, and thus came about the most consequential slogan of the July uprising, Tumi ke ami ke Rajakar, Rajakar, who are you, who am I, Rajakar, Rajakar. But it wasn't only those in power. At times, the students themselves distinguished themselves from Chhatro of, let's say, Bangladesh Chhatro League, which is the student cadre of the Awami League, and has played a supporting role in many of the governmental repression against dissent. And also, the students distance themselves from the figure of the Tokai, which is a moniker for street urchins, made famous by a long-running magazine cartoon from the 1980s, which is now a shorthand for illiteracy and urban vagrancy. So in that sense, the Tokai is the other of the politically conscious student. So clearly, a presumed innocence still undergirds and protects the category of Chatro in this context. However, it was the hyphenated identity of Chhatro Janota, variously translated as student people or student citizen, that once more emerged as the agent of political change. This hyphenated or compound word carries a political hope that inheres in Chhatro student, as well as the endless potentiality of Janota, a vernacular iteration that once captures the paradoxes and possibilities of the people or the masses. It is a figuration of popular political will that appears repeatedly in contemporary commentaries on collective politics in Bangladesh. The July 2024 uprising was no exception. The insurrection of 2024 has been described as an event that brought together and fused these two figures of politics. The move was not simply retrospective. Chhatro Janata was invoked even earlier at the peak of the movement. For example, Asif Mahmood, one of the main coordinators of Boishamo Biroti Chhatro Andolon, or the Students Against Discrimination, who is also now an advisor to the interim government, wrote the following on his Facebook page the day before the government collapsed, and I quote, "The student citizen uprising will continue until the fall of Sheikh Hasina. Tomorrow is the march to Dhaka. Travel to Dhaka now to witness history. Join the ultimate fight." Chhatro Janata, and as we can see in a couple of these Bengali headlines that were published the day after Hasina fled, Chhatra Janata is a figuration of the uprising's wide appeal and signals its rise above ossified ideologies. With ordinary Bangladeshis both wary and weary of party politics, the hyphenated agent of political change encapsulates a supersession of divisions long harnessed by mainstream political forces. And the last slide I wanted to show is this image of the 5-point demands that the Students Against Discrimination actually issued on October 22nd, 2024, listing the things that they want the interim government to do. And the demand that tops the list is the rewriting of the Constitution of Bangladesh, which is the hotly debated topic right now, and we can discuss it during the Q&A. So in this context, and in the light of the previous uprisings that happened historically, I would like to end by contemplating the sanctity of the category of the student itself, its presumed innocence, but also its efficacy as a subject of politics, and whether it is ultimately tenable as an agent of political change in Bangladesh. What political mileage does or can Chhatro, student, offer when wrested from Chhatro Janata or the masses, and vice versa? So I'm going to stop there, and maybe we can come back to some of these questions after we hear from the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Nusrat. Navine Murshid will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochona, for creating this space, and I'm happy to learn so much, well, not so much, but a little bit more than I did about this organization and this space that you've been creating for such a long time. So thank you, Nusrat, of course, for bringing us together. And this is a rare privilege to be talking with friends that you admire so much. So thank you for again bringing us together. So today, I want to talk about the representation of the July Uprising amidst misinformation campaigns and fear-mongering that portrayed these protests as an Islamist and anti-Hindu uprising, or as a US-backed coup. So I think I will, primarily take this opportunity to pause and reflect for a bit. As someone who's currently in Dhaka, which is not where I am usually at this time of the year, I feel with so much happening, I rarely get a breather. So I think I'm going to take this opportunity to catch my breath and sort of think through some of what has happened and what we are seeing sort of moving forward, how it is that we can get towards understanding what has happened, because I feel like this is in part where we went amiss, right? That we didn't really take the time to sit and reflect and debrief about what happened, who did what, who participated and why, what role did the various political parties play, what role did the Islamists actually play, right? And I think it's a little unfortunate and even sad that we still don't really know, right? So one of the leaders, coordinators a few days ago said that, this was always an anti-government movement in the guise of a quota reform movement. That's what it was all along. And this comes as a surprise, at least to me, maybe others, maybe not to others. Who knows, right? And I think this is something by now we should have known, right? Was this always an anti-government movement? What role did I'm sorry. What role did the various actors play here? So especially now that there are so many theories about who participated and why, and given how that has a link to how it's been represented elsewhere, I feel like this lack of clarity becomes an issue, right? Because this allows conspiracy theories to thrive. But what remains unclear also is which were true all along and which became self-fulfilling prophecies, right? So is this something that we're making up in retrospect, or or was this always true? And so there's this contradiction of sorts, right? So on the one hand, there's so much information, and on the other hand, we know so little, right? And so every time we try to look for more information, we are always fed things like there's inside information, there's intel from within various guarded political quarters. There, this information that will apparently change how we analyze things, but somehow, as researchers or analysts, so we're not privy to them. Right? So there's this space of white noise, and this inability to trust the information around us, combined with this desire for information, which I think creates this perfect ground for suspicion, right? And allowing for fabricated representations that we see across the world. And and I guess that's in part the unfortunate bit, that it's not that we can say that 100% this is this or this is not that, right? We can sort of offer lenses to understand what's going on, give a sense of what the various incentives are, but beyond that, it's been, I think, difficult to sort of um, bring all of it together in a sort of consistent thread, right? And I think it's this sort of post-uprising period that's critical, right? This post-uprising period, the very first day or after the interim government takes oath, we start with all these sessions called "What do we want from the interim government?" The demands from the interim government, ideas exchanges with the interim government, right? And so, I think that's when we could have taken a step back and said, okay, let's analyze what has happened, right? Instead of just jumping into what do we want from the government now. And then imagine, right, that for the last 16 years, people didn't really have much voice. People couldn't come out and say what they wanted. And then all of a sudden, people are being encouraged to come up and speak. Apparently now criticism will be taken and taken well, and so on. And so since then, there have been, and there continues to be, hundreds and hundreds of meetings and gatherings, the point of all of which is to tell the interim government what people's expectations are, what people want. And as you can imagine, the classic problem with direct democracy, it's chaos, right? How can you incorporate so many voices? What that's an impossibility. So there seem to be no mechanisms yet to streamline the demands process, and so in absence of that, and I guess in recognition of the fact that an ever increasing list of demands cannot be fulfilled, some of these, well, many of these demands have escalated into protests. So, for example, this week, the big thing is that there are 7 or so high schools that want university status in the name of equality. Everyone is apparently mobilizing, and these high school students think that their high schools are qualified to be universities, and apparently they meet all the criteria of a university. That's what they're saying in these protests, right? And so there's a new issue every day, and the roads are blocked, traffic's stalled, and so there's this sort of sense of chaos every day, and it's sort of unending in that sense, right? So, if the quota reform movement and the anti-government movement was sort of this single issue movement, or two issue movement that's sequential, here this is this melting pot of all kinds of demands and protests and so on. And so it's in part what Nusrat was just saying, right? That here we've had students mobilizing, and they brought down the government. And I think in this period, there's this concern that it's the students who brought about political change, but they will not be the ones who are the beneficiaries, right? And so it's like students of all forms and guises are kind of coming out in order to make their demand, right? And so, of course, there are two of them, as Nusrat also mentioned, that there are two students in the interim government, but they're not actually technically students. They're student leaders, but they're students who've completed their masters like 2 years ago or something, right? So they're not technically students, but leaders who've led the students, right? So this too becomes a source of tension, right? That as we sort of think about the Chhatro Janata complex, students and people, right? Who are students? Who are people? Where do students find themselves in their relationship with political parties? Are they independent of political parties? What about student parties? Can they actually be independent or not? So these are the sort of various questions that are coming up, which I think are in part what's informing these kinds of protests on the street, right? So this sort of multiplicity of ideas and demands, right? So I guess at the very least, this is really a very interesting case study in political mobilization and the demands from democracy, or maybe how the suspension of democratic rights produces anarchic tendencies in a period of political change. Yeah? So I say all of this to sort of say how this kind of chaos affects how Bangladesh, these protests, how the student movement, how the regime change, all of this finds representation at the international level also, right? And I think the first thing to note, of course, is to sort of say that the international community, however defined, will always see some kind of problem with political change, right? We'll see it with suspicion, right? So first in Sri Lanka, then in Bangladesh, and here are all these cases where popular uprisings have overthrown dictatorships, and how would great powers or regional hegemons like India react, right? So maybe we could dismiss Sri Lanka as an outlier because it's a small island nation, it's a small economy, relatively speaking, with an acute economic crisis. But Bangladesh is slightly different, right? Bangladesh has become increasingly important as a geolocation. It's a site of geopolitics or great power politics also, where the superpowers of the day are kind of trying to assert control. And so, of course, anything that creates any kind of instability is going to be suspicious, right? And we see that even in this period, there are all kinds of fear mongering that goes on. But I think what's important to note is that fear mongering isn't necessarily based on false claims, right? And that some of these conspiracy theories often contain a tiny element of truth that allow it to become sensationalized, right? And so, and what they do is that these conspiracy theories show this odd congruence between local and global perspectives, and it sort of thrives in this kind of climate of limited freedoms that oddly continue. Right, and so these then serve as warnings. Like, so for example, right now, I think Bangladesh is the only country in the world with so many journalists with cases of murder against them, right? So that who would have thought that there are so many journalists who are murderers, right? And so there's this kind of ludicrity that's also happening, right? And so I say this to also say that how this climate of conspiracy theories that have connections to both local to the local and the global kind of had been weaponized during this autocratic regime of the past 16 years, like Nusrat was saying, that this idea of an Islamist threat is from Awami League's playbook also, right? This is the threat that the Awami League government was apparently saving the nation from, right? That it lingers, and I think it lingers in the way that it does because there's this sort of connection between how this rhetoric was utilized in the past 16 years, how there are these elements that you can point to in this transition period, and how there are global interests. I'm sorry, I'm probably talking too much. I'll stop soon, I promise. Right. I just want to highlight a few things about the various interests, right? That there are. Why is there such an interest in creating this Islamist threat? And I think it's important to remember that all the stakeholders here have something to gain, right? So for the United States, for example, an Islamist threat would mean that they could link Bangladesh to their global war on terror campaign that would allow them to make inroads into Bangladesh to save it, right? Our good old savior complex. For India, an Islamist threat in Bangladesh allows them to play upon the Hindus under threat narrative and serves its domestic political purposes and justifies policies like the NRC CAA, right? That would offer citizenship rights to minority groups in Bangladesh, i.e., Hindus in Bangladesh, right? And we've seen that the Indian media throughout July and August, and even now, they've just played up this angle with some groups even insisting that India intervene militarily, right, to save Bangladesh from an Islamist threat. The Army League, of course, locally, the Army League has a lot to gain because they had effectively thrived on the polarization along secular religious lines, claiming to protect the nation from Islamic fundamentalism, like we just discussed. Right? And so the rise of Islamism now would offer the perfect justification for Army League's return. And, of course, the greatest beneficiaries would probably be the actual Islamists, right? Jamaat, Shibir, and others, for whom this fashioning of the threat effectively empowers them, right? Portrayed as more powerful than they are and vilified for their beliefs, provided the ground to actually organize and live up to their name. So these are the occasions where I would say that, you can create self-fulfilling prophecies, right? So I think what's important to remember, going back to the July days, is that it's not that people didn't recognize that there could have been this risk of an Islamist threat, right? But I think despite those risks, people wanted Sheikh Hasina out, right? That their positioning was that, okay, we handle this first. If there is an Islamist threat, we'll fight that later. Yeah? And so between the U.S. war on terror and Indian communalism, I think the sentiment of the day was that they would be able to handle it. If they could handle Sheikh Hasina's government, they would be able to handle everything else, right? And so I think just by way of conclusion, I think what I would like to say is that it's not that there is no Islamist threat, given that it's been cultivated over decades, right, as a political project. But I think the question for the day is probably some variation of whether liberal democracies can accommodate Islam, or conversely, whether Islam can accommodate a liberal democracy, right? So what's emerging in terms of what looks like outright culture wars, it's as we speak, there's emerging violence in Chittagong. A mosque has been shot at, someone died, and so it's an ongoing situation, along religious lines. So I think the critical question becomes this: so what's this relationship between democracy and religiosity? I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much, Navine. And now, may I please invite our last speaker, Naeem Mohaiemen.
Thank you, Rochona, and thank you to Nusrat for organizing. I'm going to go to my slides now. So one common thread in the remarks, especially I think from Navine, but also from Nusrat, has been actually the reinvention of our very recent history. We heard from Navine about these new claims that are being made about there being a plan all along, which I personally am quite skeptical about. I think there's a lot of backward rewriting of the history to give a continuous genealogy. And so in that context of claiming this very recent history as something more organized and systematic and leading somewhere than it actually is, I thought looking at the forms of graffiti and murals in the cities of Bangladesh after the uprising would be a useful window. I should say here that both the words graffiti and mural should be within quotes, because a lot of what you'll see here are highly organized after the fact, sometimes funded mural projects. This one you can see actually spans multiple walls. I am indebted to the photographic work of three photographers who have been trained at the Pathshala School. Mritika Gain, who has been photographing in Dhaka, Shadman Shakib, who has been photographing in Dinajpur, and Abhijit Shubho, who has been photographing in Chittagong. And what they have been looking at is the current sets of murals and graffiti. And we have already seen that most of those are not what existed back in July when the uprising was happening. So you are now in the zone of officially sanctioned murals. And I'll talk about what that means. A seminar in 2013, we were discussing yet another anniversary. An older gentleman interrupted me, stern finger raised high. You must strive to present Shotik Itihash. I wondered then, as I do now, who was going to decide for us once again what was and is correct history. If statues must die, something must come in their place. There can be no vacuum in such a contested space of semiotic signaling, especially in a turbulent new situation. Hannah Arendt warned us about the problem of the day after tomorrow. She predicted in a 1970 essay in The New Yorker, the most radical revolutionary will become a conservative on the day after the revolution. This has been an animating concern for at least parts of the Bangladesh liberal elite, who hold on to their fast eroding position as guardians of a national project. New statues, named highways, and museums have a long timeline. In the abbreviated 100 days since the collapse of the old regime, the streets of our cities have emerged as the new sites for erecting slogans, icons, and images. These propose to be multiple answers to that question posed by Humayun Azad: is this the Bangladesh we wanted? Yet there is something highly mediated about the graffiti or murals that have emerged since the August uprising. Before looking at the specific instances of graffiti and murals in post-uprising Bangladesh, I consider an essay by anthropologist Lotte Hook based on her 2010 fieldwork with Dhaka's poster wallas, young men who put up wheat-posted posters in the dead of night. Hook underlines that this work of postering is continually remaking the city's surfaces with an emphasis on the next blockbuster cinema release. Walls here are densely populated and a contested semiotic and material site, where rival cinema posters jostle with party posters. I should note here that her fieldwork period was 2010, a much earlier time when an uneasy equilibrium existed between multiple political parties. For the last decade, the city walls have mostly been blanketed by officially sanctioned murals and posters. The contestation of Hook's fieldwork period has been efficiently erased. However, this new post-uprising period is also marked by a high level of officially sanctioned murals, rendered wall to wall, sometimes even split between multiple walls. This indicates that many of these projects are funded, or at least supported, with a surplus of time, painting supplies, and access. These are not the nocturnal, anonymous, on-the-go postings that Hook recorded. These murals take time to complete and must be done in the daytime. Before looking at a few of these examples, let us look at the unofficial graffiti that covered the streets in the weeks before the August fall of the regime. Unlike the ornate murals I just showed you, here you see a rushed spray-painted slogan with no attempt at generating cursive handwriting and sometimes with spelling mistakes. The slogans hit at the target, almost always expressing in the language of what they oppose. Here, unnayon lagbe na, pet bhore khete chai, or we don't need development, we want to have a full stomach. Or prokritir bajarikoron bondho koro, stop the commercialization or marketization of nature. Dine natok, rate atok, or by day you present stage dramas and at night you arrest us. And finally, channeling the hip-hop pioneer's public enemy, F the police. By late August, we started seeing what I call hybrids, where half the wall was still the rushed spray-painted slogans, but in one corner was emerging a style that graffiti mavens used to call tags, but in the last decade has moved to a style of writing that's called blockbuster. Here is one word in red blockbuster style, biplob or revolution. And underneath the rest of the sentence, dekhai na TVte, or not shown on TV, a variation of Gil Scott-Heron's iconic spoken word piece, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. We then move to the officially sanctioned murals, many celebrating the role of what is called, now to the point of semiotic exhaustion, Gen Z. And note here the face and eyes rendered in a style borrowed from Japanime. Many of the murals commemorate iconic, but already faded from memory, moments from the uprising, particularly the forms of spectacular state violence. Here, a helicopter gunship shooting on a masoom or innocent child, or a rickshawala transporting the wounded to safety. Another set of murals transpose phrases that gained wide popularity during the uprising on social media. For example, on the top right, Oi Mama, Na Please, a mixed English-Bengali hybrid or Banglish, which is a derisive response to every pronouncement from both state machinery and the elite. And on the bottom left, the eager acceptance of the power of rumors to destabilize the regime. Under each unbelievable but maybe true new rumor would be this phrase, source, chalaidan, or source, just make it spread. Beyond the commemoration of a generation, or martyrs, or catchphrases, these murals are now being deployed to answer a phrase often seen in the culture of seminars that have mushroomed since August. Each seminar title includes the phrase "camon" or "what kind" and "chai" or "do we want," and in between are the subject: university, culture, literature, nation, and so on. This mural illustrates the role of advertising agencies and NGOs in flattening the language of demand until you are left with this anodyne single word, সংস্কার, or reform. Reform has, by the way, been the promise of each elected, non-elected, or military regime over the last 53 years. Alongside this overused word are illustrations of students cleaning garbage and directing traffic. A model of citizen governance which yielded some results in the first weeks after the collapse, but by now have been replaced by more sharp-edged power struggles between new blocs within the student body. More specific are these murals, with their focus on tea plantation workers, one of the first labor groups that went on strike in August after the regime collapsed. Also very pointed and with potential impact on land rights are these murals that talk about the indigenous community of Chittagong Hill Tracts that first waged a 20-year guerrilla war for independence in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and now has been dealing with 20 plus years of a post-peace accord situation of non-results. Here, the slogan says, Bondhu cholo pahare, dukkho dekhai tomare. Friend, come with me to the mountains. Let me show you what sadness looks like. Note, however, that even this well-meaning mural uses the archaic ethnics rather than Adivasi. And the messaging makes no mention of the military that plays a dominant role in suppressing indigenous rights in this area. A reminder that the current interim government depends on the support of the military, both law and order, and its own shaky legitimacy. I end with this set of murals taken from different locations that gives a first sense of a political contestation about the role of religion, and in particular Islam, within the new political order that is expected to come after elections. The classic imagery here is a bloody, severed fist carrying the flag and a rising sun, again in a Japanese style, floating over mosque, church, gurdwara, and temple. Another mural pairs Shangram or struggle with the same helicopter gunship image, and watching over the scene in the style of Soviet realist posters are three faces that seem to commingle faith and ethnicity, especially in the third figure, who appears to be marked as indigenous. Other murals struggle to represent faith through face or clothing. While the slogan says Dharmo jar jar desh shobar, or religion is individual, but the country is everybody's, we note that the presumably Muslim man at the end has not such visible markers of faith. Or what does it say about the drawing imagination that the everyman is of one faith? These murals, we can call them secular, live alongside these ornate other murals, relatively new within popular street iconography, of highly detailed Islamic calligraphy. This is rendered in a style reminiscent of the world geometric forms documented by Brinkley Messick in his ethnographic study, A Calligraphic State. It should be noted here that these calligraphic pieces have resulted in frisson and friction within at least one part of the opinion shapers. At Dhaka University, a small storm in a teacup brewed when a university professor was falsely accused of trying to stop calligraphic muralists. I want to end with this mural, which is a tongue-in-cheek slogan. Shuno, dharmo ar desh milate jeo na, pore fuler naam ki diba, Fatima Chura. Or, listen, don't mix religion and country. What will you later call the flower? Fatima Chura. The replacement of the Hindu deity Krishna with a Muslim name of a woman Fatima is itself a semiotic collision. While the sentiments of secularism may be admirable as a goal, the language here suggests a scarcity of imaginary options. The slogan reads as a scolding gesture, secularism defended on the grounds of language continuity. These declarations of a desire for a secular state seem to be bright on the walls. Indeed, they're rendered in bright colors, but they fade in the actuality of the ongoing power struggles. They suggest that the wish projection via murals has its own limitations. The Bangla phrase, Dewale likhon jayna khondon, means the writing on the wall cannot be avoided. Here, the writing on the wall is also the fate. But considering the cycle of history wars in Bangladesh, the writing on the wall exists to be written over, erased, and reborn at each new conjuncture. Thank you.
Thank you all for we have the panelists back on screen, please.
Sorry, I might need the moderator's help to get out of my sharing.
Okay, I think Anna will help you.
And I can probably end my sharing.
Well, I
I
think
right at the top of your screen name, does it say stop sharing?
Yeah, the mouse is not touching it because I hit the meeting controls. Anna, if you just do share, that'll stop my sharing. You can just share anything.
oh, good.
There
Okay.
we go.
Thank you.
We actually have a great audience here, and I want to encourage them to please put their questions down in the chat, and I'll probably call on people as best as I can. So to just get us started, maybe I'll ask something to each of the panelists, and also invite the panelists, if you have questions of one another, to get us started that way. But one thing I have to say is, with all of you, you've all written books where so much of what you spoke, and you wrote the books a while ago. I mean, in Nusrat's case, Paradoxes of the Popular, we're seeing it happen again. And, there's a sense in which I feel like you had a sense of the pulse of things, which is not to say that all of this was premeditated, but there's something so prescient about each one of your works that I just wanted to remark on. So very quickly, Nusrat, I wanted, if you could, talk a little bit more about the coalition politics of, that constituted the Chhatra Janata, because I want to learn a little bit more about it. You spoke very beautifully about the figure of the Chhatro, and then ended, or towards the end, you were talking about the Tokai. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the different coalitions. For Navine, again, I cannot tell you how much conspiracy theories actually resonate with the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, because so many of my colleagues did this mega project called Conspiracy/Theory. So this really does resonate, but I wanted to invite you to actually talk about the book that came out last year. And in terms of your talk today, so India's Bangladesh problem and some of the things you highlighted in the talk. And Naeem, that was really, it was a very moving presentation. But my question is kind of more prosaic, because both in the statue destruction as well as the murals, I mean, you hit a note which was very poignant, and I respect that. But could you actually talk, because both are very global. I mean, the set of images that you showed us in the beginning were actually referring to statue destructions all over, in many parts of the world and across time. And then in the murals, there was definitely uh, influences of Japanese anime, college graffiti in different parts of, say, the subcontinent. So could you, or if you're in a position to, can you actually talk about uh, how the world comes in into into the thinking of these groups, both both established groups and oppositional groups? I'll stop there. And again, I want to invite our audience to please put their questions in the chat, and I'll call on you. And thank you again to our panelists. So you can go in whatever order.
I can start. Thank you for that question. And I think listening to all of us today, including myself, I realized that we are at this point when we are really trying to make sense of the messiness of it all, right? And as somebody who studies popular politics, it's always messy when you are, when you're actually talking to people. And I think a kind of, if people are disillusioned, then they were actually nurturing some kind of fantasy that is never there when it comes to popular politics, right? I think, the way this student movement came into being, and that's why I think the category of the student, carrying some kind of sanctity is actually really important to think about, because some of the movements that happened before, and as Navine mentioned, that now some of the students are saying this was always anti-government or whatever. Yes, but there were also many students for whom that was not an issue at all, right? But I think one of the main things that brought the students together and that helped garner support from ordinary people was the fact that there was party political affiliations were secondary to the identification as a student. So now a lot of people I know talk about how, the landmarks that were vandalized were done by, Chhatro Shibir, which is the student wing of Jamaat-e-Islami, but Chhatro Shibir is still Chhatro. You might not, think of them as student in the same way as you would if they were, let's say, activists of the Communist Party of Bangladesh or something. But I think, and I remember very vividly some of the comments that were made by the student coordinators at the time that we don't care which political party you're affiliated with, as long as you come here as your student, and that is the primary identity, right? And I think what is happening now is precisely trying to kind of chip away from that, that kind of edifice of the student activist, right? Now trying to put people in different groups and with different affiliations. And in fact, some of the people who are feeling the most insecure are the main political parties. I mean, just yesterday I was listening to one of the former members of parliament of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party. And if I don't know if you have seen this, but the chief advisor to the interim government, Muhammad Yunus, when he was at the UN last month, he introduced one of the student coordinators as the mastermind, right? And a comment that actually generated a lot of discussion, also conspiracy theories, because that would assume that this was being planned for a long time. And then people were also saying, no, Muhammad Yunus doesn't really speak in a political language. He's just so excited. And so he just used the term mastermind. And one of the former MPs of BNP was saying that, well, if the students were the mastermind, we were the master brain, because we have been doing it for a long time, right? But that comes from a certain kind of insecurity, because they haven't been able to accomplish what the students have. But I do think that despite the messiness, despite the different kind of ideologies, there was something about the category of the student that actually that was privileged, and that privileging of the student identity actually helped garner a lot of kind of wide support. And of course, Chhatra Janata as kind of a hyphenated category, I think really personifies that wide support, because it's not just the students, it's also the people. And now who the Janata is, of course, is a very messy topic. So I think that at one point the student category, beyond these kinds of affiliations, beyond these kinds of other coordinates of identification, I think really helped bring this together and propel this forward. And a lot of these students were actually active in some of the previous movements, right? So the 2018 quota reform movements, the Nirapad Shorok road safety movement, and some of them who are now active in the kind of students against discrimination were teenagers at the time, were high school students. But their kind of political training has been happening for a few years. But again, it's the identity of the student that I think has been important in kind of moving this forward and garnering wide support. And that's why I think at this point, it is also the identity of the student that is being questioned to kind of delegitimize some of the aspects of the movement. So I'm just going to stop here and let others respond to their questions, and we can come back to some of these later on. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we'll just go in the order that we were called on. And well, the book. I don't know where to start. I think that the relevant. I think I'll just see where the relevance is in terms of the mobilization and I think and also the kind of representation. And I think the critical thing here is anti-Indian sentiments that became pretty important in recent months, right? And and it's dialectical, right? That here's how the Indian media represents Bangladesh, and then the response from Bangladesh, of course, sort of is a negative response, right? And so I think it. So in my book, my book is really about India, Bengali Muslims in India, and how India-Bangladesh relations implicate Bengali Muslims in India because of the conflation between Bengali Muslims and Bangladeshis, right? And how 1971, of course, couldn't be that kind of a period which offers Bangladesh as the home of all Bengali Muslims. That wasn't the political project, right?
It's a book on Bengali Muslims, but the analytical segment has to do with the sort of hierarchical relationship or the subservient relationship between India and Bangladesh, and how the idea that Bangladesh and Bangladeshis should be grateful for India's help in 1971 lays the groundwork for subsequent subservience. Right? That become and that gratitude sort of becomes later on not just about India's help in 1971, but also in the last 16 years, India's help in maintaining the Awami League government, right, in a variety of ways. And so I think the relevant aspect here then is trying to understand anti-Indian sentiments through an anti-imperialist lens and not necessarily through communalism, right? Because that's often where we go, right? That anti-Indian sentiments of course, has an effect on the Hindu minorities in Bangladesh, right, who get attacked or repressed as India's proxy citizens. Right? And but I think that's the critical part here, that there's that element of proxy citizenship that renders Hindus in Bangladesh vulnerable. In ways not dissimilar to how Bengali Muslims or other Muslims in India, for that matter, find themselves vulnerable in India. I guess my book really looks at how in more recent years neoliberalism, neoliberal policies, neoliberal sensibility kind of grafts onto these pre-existing tensions, whether communal or caste or the varieties of hierarchies that exist on the basis of language, region, and so on. How that grafting then allows for the sustained marginalization of various groups. And so I guess in that way we can think about how Hindus in Bangladesh are also implicated, right? And I think it's in terms of this representation, I think it's really important to say that that the representation of the narrative of Hindus under threat is highly problematic and inaccurate. But at the same time, it's also important to say that it's not that there's no such threat. Right? That Hindus are vulnerable in Bangladesh, right? We cannot say that that's not happening, right? So on August 5th, along with Road 32 is where Sheikh Mujib's home was, and which had turned into a museum. All the homes in that on that street got burnt down, right? Among those was the home of musician Rahul Anando, who's Hindu, right? And so in that moment, that his home was burnt down was presented as a communal attack, when in fact it was a terrible thing, that sort of burning down, but it wasn't because he was Hindu, right? But it was presented as one that it was, right? So I guess the point here is about who benefits from these kinds of assertions, these kinds of blame games. I think drawing I don't think I'm able to draw much more about from the book in explaining this, but basically to just show that ethnic tensions or ethnic conflict or communal tensions, these are manufactured, right, for political and economic gain at multiple levels.
Naeem, did you?
Yes, you had raised two questions, actually kind of similar line about the specter of globalization and globalized language, both for the statue sequence and then for the murals. So just to clarify, the statue sequence, the globalized aspect, which is of course Saddam statue, multiple statues of Lenin collapsing, and other statues from former Soviet Union. That's my intervention to commingle those with the statues of Sheikh Mujib being pulled. I don't pull down. I don't think those attacking his statue on August 5th or 6th were thinking of Lenin. Majority of that crowd was born after 1989. So the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, these are our imaginaries and reference points. It is not for that generation at all. They responded, frankly, with the fury of the old regime is gone. At astonishing speed, which is why I have to raise my eyebrows every time I hear these mastermind theories. I don't think so. I think it was much closer to what Nusrat has written about in her book about crowds and power and contagion and the fana and the energy that the group gets when everybody's together. And now there's all this backwards engineering of a narrative so that it doesn't appear to be spontaneous and even to some degree a series of, the movement's biggest energy was the regime and its mistakes. The statue, one interesting thing to talk about, though, is it's not really a gold statue, but it's a gold-plated statue, or it looks like a gold-plated statue. It was an extraordinarily expensive statue. We heard figures that were double-digit crores. These numbers stick in people's heads. We haven't spoken about it, but there were a series of financial scandals right before July, which were in a line of a financial scandals, but these came very close to home. The prime minister's own personal secretary, for one thing, and these people had all fled the country. People remember these numbers in very abstract ways, and then they project that number, an astonishingly large number, 40 crore, a number you can't actually figure out how to write out, and you project it into this, what is actually a golden statue, but looks like a gold statue. So the fury of the crowd is also not just to the figure, but the financial ruination and loss that's embedded within that. And I think that was the biggest impetus for attacking the statue that I basically cut and interposed with these other pieces. The murals, though, is a different matter. And I think it's useful now to talk about not just a globalized language, but the role of the English language and hybrid Bangladeshi language. So I've written about this elsewhere. I think one of the things that made the June, July, August uprising particularly unmanageable for the government is it represents a sum total of all the strategies and language that I really dislike this term, but let's just use it for now, Gen Z and its affiliates have picked up, which, by the way, I think as language is not language that we are suited to represent. None of us are from that generation. Most of the things that I reference here, I almost always have to ask someone, what does this mean? Usually my niece, and I would almost always get this response of, where have you been for the last 5 years? This is the chalu phrase in Dhaka. Obviously, I'm not plugged into it. But one of the ways that mattered, especially the mixing of English and Bangla, I think it actually also confuses the search algorithms, right? So, oi mama na please has English and Bangla in the same sentence. And it's a lot of these phrases that if you just see that phrase, it doesn't mean anything. Irony was a very big language underlying of a lot of the slogans and responses. So you'd actually see mini videos. Many of these have disappeared because they are those 1-minute things that stay on Instagram. You'd see a video that would appear to be complimenting someone from the government. And just the caption says, oi mama na, please, right? So you're like, oh. So I think all of those have bled into the murals. Not all. I think some of the murals I showed about secularism are very much like after the fact, very sanitized, very organized, invoking again the 1971 posters, invoking, frankly, I think a very exhausted secular imaginary. And then the style, Japanime, Korean animation, these things are just really big and they flow through. I will say that I'm very interested in the passage of time and how it affects how we look back. So I wrote a piece 2 days after the fire. August 5th was the collapse. Fire was that day or this next day. I wrote a piece 2 days later. 8 days after that, arrived in Dhaka. And one of the first things one of my friends said is that if you had been in Dhaka through the uprising, you might not have written this piece because you would have understood better people's anger and been worried about writing a piece about the burning of Sheikh Mujib's house as a tragedy. So already within 15 days, you can see what the passage of time is doing and what location is doing. So I'm read as located in the United States and therefore somehow removed government, and then those who have been through the movement have this authenticity. Some of what Navine is referring to is also this battle of authenticity. Who was more involved? Who spent more time? All of those things are filtering through. What to me in terms of street murals is, I think, very much a backwards engineered trying to build a continuous narrative of this is what we fought for. Whereas with both Nusrat and Navine have indicated, there is not necessarily agreement on what we fought for.
Yeah, absolutely. Nusrat has her hand up, so yes, please.
Yeah, just to add to what Naeem was saying about language, I mean, the use of, I mean, of course, it's a Gen Z language, which none of us gets, obviously, but there's also a strategy involved in this. So I was told that a lot of students used English that they normally wouldn't to actually attract, let's say, private university students. And private university and public university is a very important distinction to keep in mind in this context, because, you know, the quota reforms would actually affect public university students much more directly because they're the ones who mostly go for government jobs. But the fact that this movement had support of students whose lives would not be directly affected by this was actually very important. And I was told that some of the programming that happened, you know, like Long March to Dhaka, or there are some others that I'm forgetting now, it was very consciously a particular kind of, you know, English was actually, you know, added to have these programs much broader appeal. And the other thing I wanted to say is that language, you know, like Naeem was talking about kind of the visual language of secularism, but the actual language of secularism is also something that was being rejected. So, you know, the last slide that I showed, which is, you know, the Boishomya Biroti Chhatra Andolon's, you know, 5 points, the latest one, they actually use the word spirit as opposed to chetona. And chetona is directly associated with this kind of Awami League language of Mukti Juddhe Chetona, the spirit of 1971. And one of the students told me that we are just using spirit now as a placeholder, although spirit also has these ghostly connotations. So they're a little worried about it, but they just don't want to use a language that, you know, as Naeem was saying, has been exhausted. So I think the English, the drawing from English is also partly strategic to distance oneself from a kind of secular language, as well as for the movement to have a broader appeal.
I think our panelists have actually addressed some of the questions that have specifically to do with India and so forth. So I'm not going to actually read those out, but we have some students from, or we have some questions from students and other colleagues here. So I'm just going to start with the last one, which is coming from Lotta, which says, I have a question for Nusrat about the nature of the hyphen between Chhatro and Janata. What does the hyphen indicate, and whether this fusing is by necessity temporary to allow it to convey political potentiality? And a question for Naeem about the funded mural, not so much about the details about who and what or how much, but instead whether the non-funded wall painting or text is generally the minority genre in the public imagery dominating the public space. Now, before you start answering, I want to read out a couple more so that you can club them together and respond to them. This one is to all of the three speakers. What is the lesson to be learned for Bangladesh from this mass uprising? And what does the future hold in terms of the performance of the interim government so far and the road to reform and elections? It's from Zareen Ali. I'm going to shorten this question from Uday Jain, but put it to you nonetheless. 2 questions for the panelists. What are some of the common misunderstandings or insecurities about the seeming loss of their power that political and bourgeois elites in Bangladesh are articulating at this moment? And then, do you have suggestions on how South Asian academics in the US and academics and comrades more broadly can act in solidarity with the student revolution in Bangladesh? And one last one, perhaps, again, question for Nusrat. It has to do with student unity and what you make of the splintering, tearing, and infighting, as well as destruction of educational institutes by students themselves, speaks to a renewed tribalism, etc. So that's a lot, and there are more, and I'm sure they'll keep coming, but let's see let's give our panelists a chance to respond to some of them. And again, my apologies if I haven't been able to ask everything, but our time is limited.
Thanks, Lotta. I'm going to do this very quickly, and of course, we can always talk off channel. It's very interesting that it's hyphenated, because not very many Bangla words are hyphenated unless they're directly translated from English. Because, and I'm going to geek out here a little bit because they're Samashbadh Shabd, right? When you have Shamash, you don't need hyphenation. So I think it's really interesting that Chhatra Janata has survived the hyphenation. And I think the hyphenation is important because it keeps both the categories separate with their, kind of characteristics, but they're also fused, which kind of signals, kind of widespread support or purchase of the term. Navida Khan recently wrote a very short piece in the Daily Star about Chhatra Janata, and she actually disagrees with me on this issue. She thinks that I am, keeping the hyphenation and keeping the two things separate, whereas she looks at it as becoming something else. But I actually want to keep holding on to the hyphenation, and I think this is very important because you can always disentangle the two. If it's just Janata, as you know, I have written about this and we have talked about this, that Janata can also be a mob. The people who vandalized, Bongo Bhavan or সংসদ Bhavan were Janata, but they were not Chhatra Janata. So as soon as it becomes Chhatra Janata, it kind of carries a certain kind of political potentiality that I think is very important. But of course, it would be interesting to actually talk to people who write the headlines, for example, like when did it become Chhatra Janata from, a Chhatra Andolon, right? I mean, that shift, I think, is very important. But this is, of course, something that I want to think about more and write about. And if I could quickly, before we go to the others, about the last question about Chhatra, because it was I was asked that question. I mean, unity in popular politics is often ephemeral. It's often transitory, right? Nobody, I think, ever had the delusion that student as a category would actually be unified, because there is also now a lot of kind of not just conspiracy theory, but just speculation about whether the students are going to form their own political party or not. And for some people, that's an exciting possibility. For some people, that's not an exciting possibility, because that threatens, the kind of legitimacy or the staying power of the more, conventional political parties. So I think a lot of times these kinds of unity happen in times of crisis. And I think that's what happened at that point, at that moment. And now students, like the example that Navine gave about high school students wanting their institutions to become universities. Yes, that is true. And right now in Bangladesh, you can get away with a lot by being a student, right? It has really become a certain kind of category with a lot of purchase. But at the same time, it's not just, students of high schools. There are, ethnic groups, indigenous groups, ethnic minorities. There are garment factory workers. There are civil servants. Everybody is on the street, right? And I just recently wrote a piece in Journal of Democracy, and I ended the piece by saying, democracy is still a lot of work, but politics has indeed come back in Bangladesh, right? The fact that you can come out on the streets and say these things, whether we like it or not, it's chaotic, but it's also politics. So I think unity is something that we should always be a little suspicious of, not in a kind of cynical sense, but asking too much of unity, or asking unity to survive, something like this is problematic. And I think we will always be disappointed if we look for that kind of unity to survive a political crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we go in the order that you all presented, and maybe Navine first, and then Naeem can.
Okay, all right. So, I think I'll just say a few things. I guess I'll start where Nusrat left off in terms of this unity question, right? I think if we look at the quota reform period, even then we know that there wasn't really the kind of unity that we saw subsequently when it turned into an anti-government movement, right? So, because some of these demands from the students were actually quite regressive, right? So they didn't want quotas for women, and there was a debate about that, and all kinds of things where you would think that, okay, this is really something that they have to talk it out and deliberate, and it gets resolved through discussion, and not necessarily something that Chhatra Janata would fall in line to support, right? Primarily because some of these were actually pretty regressive, right? So the transformation from the quota reform movement to an anti-government reform, to an anti-government movement is then a very important one. And I think that's where the Chhatra Janata element becomes useful, right? I think I do like this sort of understanding of Chhatra Janata as being separate and yet fused, because of the potential for it to be either or and both, when necessary. But I also know that this is often the kind of cover that students or even other political movements use as a way to sort of create unity, right? That who are we? Okay, we are Chhatra Janata, right? Because we will we at least aspire to have a movement that brings together students and people, right? And I think part of it has to do with the sort of middle class nature of student movements, right? That how is it that you get other segments of the population into this movement, right? That if it's only a Chhatra movement, then it has its pitfalls in terms of who it can potentially include, right? So even in this period, there's this ongoing question about what about workers? What about peasants? Where do they fit in this Chhatra Janata movement? Are they part of it, or has this largely been middle class uprising, right? And I remember during the July days also, we would say that, so why aren't garments workers coming out? And even then it sort of felt odd to be saying that, because it felt odd to say that garments workers should take to the streets for an issue that has to do with students and their well-being, something that will never affect them, that the only role that they could potentially play is dying. And then now we do know that there were many garments workers who actually died, but we don't really know of them, right? And so in this sort of portrayal of this movement as a student movement, we actually do know that there are garments workers who were part of it, who died here, but they're not martyrs in the way that students have been, right? So I guess all of this is to say that when we talk about unity, it's actually not really there in that sense, right? It's a fragmented kind of unity, right? So garments workers joined not as workers, they joined as parents, as neighbors, as friends, and so on, right? And so they were part of the Janata there. So I think I'll just end there. The other thing I wanted to add to the conversation in terms of the murals and the wall art and so on. One is about the sort of synchronity, right? That I think what was very powerful during the time was how memes on social media, wall art, and slogans sort of synced together to give a unified message, right? So we knew what was happening, why they were mobilizing, what were the talking points, when is it that this is transitioning from one kind of movement to the other. The other thing I want to sort of think out loud about is the kind of I think, Rochona, you called it sort of the global sense of it, right? That we've seen this image of Sheikh Mujib, Lenin, Saddam being pulled down, right? We've seen images of the Ganabhavan being looted in Sri Lanka and so on, people swimming in the swimming pool and so on, right? And so there's this element, right, where there's almost a kind of a blueprint, if you will, that this is what we think protests are about. This is what we think anti-government movements are about, and so we're going to do that. And I think I point this out to also say that so if you look at how the parliament and Ganabhavan was vandalized, you get a certain kind of imagery about violence and riots and so on. But at the same time, there was no government for 7 days after the uprising, and there was very limited crime. The only kind of crimes we had seen were political ones. These were targeted, not like random crimes. Stores were not looted. There were no riots. So there are people could have easily broken down glass walls to get cars and motorbikes and so on. None of that happened, right? And so, I say this to say that, this was, primarily a very peaceful kind of movement with these riot elements really a kind of copycat actions rather than something that's kind of emerging from anger. I'm sure there was anger also, but there was also this element of this is what you do during these kinds of movements, so that's why we are acting in this fashion. I think I'll end
Thank
there.
you so much, Naveen. I think you've also responded to a question that was up here about the role of social media. So thank you very much for that. So maybe we can let Naeem have the last word.
Sure. I'll just stay on the question of murals and Lotte's question about whether the sanctioned murals, what's the balance between the sanctioned and unsanctioned. But I'll just say one thing to preface it, because some of the new questions that we got, they're all along the lines of what is to be done, now and in the future. I think it's important to underscore that this is an interim government. Its only job really is to do some reforms and then hold elections. So actually, the only thing that will define what's the future direction of Bangladesh is who wins that election. And sometimes I also feel, even in our discourse, we're spending a lot of time talking about the interim government, as we should, but they have a 1-year timeline, maybe slightly more. Ultimately, the path of Bangladesh will get decided by the elections. And the fact that the students haven't formed a political party yet, I don't see that as a great sign, because if the elections were in a year's time, it's not enough time to set up grassroots. So there's a gap. There's tremendous amounts of discursive energy being spent on how to improve the interim government, even though they won't be permanent anyway. So it doesn't matter in some ways how fantastic they are. I have my own impatience sometimes with the over focus on that and not at all focusing on the election scenario. I think the murals are part of the same sort of arc of being satisfied with perhaps that which won't have a long-term impact on the direction of Bangladesh. No matter what beautiful murals you might paint, if the candidate who sees things your way, who thinks Bangladesh belongs to every religion, every community, if the candidate doesn't win, then these murals won't matter. They'll in fact get erased by the new government. I use the phrase backward engineered genealogy, and I think that's very much happening right now. I do think things that happened in July and August were a repetition of things that happened in 2014, and people learned from their mistakes, and the state did not, and that's why things played out in a very different way. From 2014 was also a quota uprising. I think the thing to note about the murals is that the 3 students from Pathshala, the 3 graduates who went out to photograph, they were actually trying to photograph the original murals and original graffiti before they disappeared, because already there was this funded project to start erasing them and putting up these very nice, fancy, multiple wall murals, which are not unofficial at all. And they were not able to, actually, I went through all the photographs, they were not able to capture very many of those. Most of those had already been erased. So they ended up, in order to bring back lots of photographs, photographing the newer, brighter ones. And if you look at the majority of the graffiti that's been erased, they also represented this popular anger, which is important to take into account, because the popular anger gave the movement velocity, right? The movement had a fierce nature to it at times as well, that also frightened elements of the state. There were parts of the state, including the police, that deserted their stations, not because they had lost faith in the government, but they had lost faith in the government to protect their own lives. It's not a nonviolent Gandhian uprising at all. And I think some of the graffiti expressed that fury, expressed the sharp personalization of that in not only the figure of the leader, but some of her key ministers who are unpopular. And there's a velocity in it that would worry us if we stop to think about what those people might do if they come to power. If that kind of zeal then moves from the previous target, which has been deposed and is no longer in the country, to its new targets, which I think is also what's happening. So the fact of erasing all of those sometimes violent graffiti, sometimes misogynist graffiti, and its replacement by these beautiful, perfectly painted murals is a kind of wish fulfillment that I don't think matches up with the actual hard work of politics that's going on the ground right now.
Thank you very much. That's actually a very thoughtful note on which to end. This was an excellent session, and it actually makes me think that we should probably have more like this. I mean, originally, I had planned this as a teach-in. It became a panel discussion, but I'm sure I speak for our audience, the organizers, and everyone when I say that we learned a lot. Thank you all for your very generous contributions. And I also want to especially recognize how difficult it is sometimes to be talking about the here and now. So I take what Navine said very seriously, that you want to take a step back, take a deep breath and comment on it, which all of you did phenomenally, beautifully. Thank you again. And thank you all for attending.